And we're recording.
Great.
Maybe Dan can kick us off. I've talked to Beth, and she's going to collect anyone from the other meeting room if they're still there and bring them here.
Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen and navigate through the material from my machine here. It looks like, Sean, I need you to enable me to share, I think, co-host. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to do this. And I'm going to do this. Okay, apologies. I'm just going to scroll back here. This is showing the plot before we actually get there. Okay, here we go. Good. Okay. Do we all see my title slide? Are we seeing my Zoom visuals on your screen, or is it simply a title slide that's primarily white with blue text?
Title slide.
Excellent. Perfect. Okay, so we'll get started here. We have somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 minutes worth of material that both Sean and I wanted to work through. Wanted to, I guess, thank our guests off the top for attending. We kind of did intros organically there in the beginning, but maybe we'll just, my name is Dan Casey. I'm a transportation planner with Urban Systems based in Victoria, and I'm our consulting project lead on the transportation and mobility strategy. My colleague Sean is on the call as well. Sean is a community planner, and he is our consulting project lead on the official community plan review. Do we want to do, Brian, Kyle, and the team, do we want to do brief introductions as well?
Might as well. So I'm Brian Murphy. I'm the Director for Public Works and Engineering with the City of Duncan, and my focus is on the transportation and mobility strategy.
Yeah, Kyle Young here, the manager of planning for the City of Duncan. Relatively new with the city. I've been here since November, so I think I'm the shortest serving planner at the City of Duncan right now.
I'm Matt Blakely. I'm a planner with City of Duncan. I have a bit more experience than Kyle. I've been here since July, so I think I have the most experience in the planning department. So excited to be a part of this.
Hi, I'm Spencer. I'm the planning technician. I was the one sending out all the emails. I'm right in the middle of Kyle and Matt with about 5 months at the City of Duncan. So yeah, really excited to be part of this as well.
Great. Do we want to go all the way around the table, just since our size is relatively limited?
Yeah, I can intro myself. I'm Brittany Taylor with Economic Development Cowichan, part of the Cowichan Valley Regional District, and also a resident of the City of Duncan.
And I'm Jen. I work for Cowichan Green Community. I'm the building manager over here and new to Duncan as well. So looking to get involved and learn about the upcoming plans.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Great kickoff here. So yeah, both Sean and I are going to work through 20 to 30 minutes worth of material. We're going to jump back and forth a little bit between the official community plan review process and the transportation and mobility strategy process. Both are very closely intertwined. And when we start talking about timelines and some of the engagement activities and what deliverables we're working through, that was done deliberately and set out by the city, and has been carried out between our planning and transportation consulting teams. So that's very deliberate. So these two processes are very much intertwined. So a quick overview, we're going to talk about the official community plan review. That includes an overview of the OCP itself, draft on the vision and goals of the OCP and draft policy directions. And then for the transportation and mobility strategy, which we're going to continually call the TMS, we're going to talk about the TMS overall framework. We're going to talk about the long-term network plans, next steps, and then we'll open it up to discussion on both OCP and TMS. I probably already touched on this, but very important, and this is, so we do these types of plans and plan reviews in a number of communities on the island, but what we're particularly enjoying on this one is it's a very closely aligned process between transportation plan and official community plan review, which has allowed for engagement activities to be shared, and for some of the technical work we're both doing to be really married up really nicely alongside one another. We also wanted to highlight some of the synergies between the work the city is doing right now and then some of the work that's happening elsewhere in the Cowichan Valley. So North Cowichan undertaking transportation master plan review as well as an OCP review. Cowichan tribes and their pre-existing transportation and mobility plan. At the CVRD level, an active transportation plan, as well as in cooperation with BC Transit, some transit future action plan follow-up from the transit future plan that was developed many years ago. And then also wanted to, very important to the TMS in particular, is this work that local jurisdictions in collaboration with the province worked on a few years back, which is a corridor management plan for the Trans-Canada Highway. And so that's proving very important and a key reference in the work that we're doing here. In terms of timeline, and I think we have a timeline slide for the OCP and a timeline slide for the TMS. So maybe I'll let Sean walk us through the process and timeline slide for the OCP.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I'll note on the last slide too, Cowichan 2050, the CVRD is also doing regional OCP as well. So, and they will be pursuing a project recently to actually do sub-area plans that would connect into that as part of their OCP update. So for the OCP process and timeline, we have our project launch last year around this time. We completed a background review and developed some of the background summary report materials that are available on PlaceSpeak. Phase 2 involved community engagement. We did some stakeholder sessions. We did a round 1 survey and on PlaceSpeak as well. And now we're kind of in phase 3, which is the plan development. So we have a draft OCP, and this is kicking off. This is kind of part of that second round of community engagement. So there's also an online survey and information on PlaceSpeak as well. So there's a lot of background, including elements of the draft plan, as well as the background summary report, which actually frames up a lot of the background review and work that we've done. So through this process, we're hoping to refine the OCP as it is, collect any input from community members like yourself and participants like yourself and stakeholders, and then build that into a final OCP that will be brought forward for adoption going later into the spring, into early summer.
Good, thanks, Sean. And so shifting over to the transportation mobility strategy, you'll notice the timeline is relatively well aligned. We've gone through generally a 4-phase process. The first phase was around starting up the project and getting some of our communications channels in place. Second phase, I should say this all kicked off plus or minus a year ago. It was about spring of 2021. We worked through the summer and into the fall on sort of developing a technical review and community understanding that included both a fairly extensive inventory of current conditions and data collection on things like traffic volumes and road widths and active transportation user trends and whatnot, and so to really inform our understanding. And that was summarized in a what we called working paper number 1, which is sitting on the PlaceSpeak, the project website. And we're now working through our phase 3, which is really around establishing the key strategy directions for the TMS. And so that includes, again, network development and technical tasks, which we're then testing with community stakeholders and through our survey as well. So that's happening right now. And then we're going to be working through through the spring to develop a draft and test and finalize the TMS. So timelines very much aligned between both OCP and TMS. So now I'll turn it back to Sean, and Sean's going to provide an overview of where the OCP review is at and some of the overarching principles and key directions from that. So go ahead, Sean.
Thanks, Dan. We're going to switch to the next slide. I'll just kind of jump in, give a high-level overview. So really, some of the key project goals here were to improve clarity. The current OCP is almost 300 pages long with appendices. So one of the key objectives was to make this a more user-friendly document that reflects the direction set out in the city's OCP. There's a lot of good elements there, but part of our work has been to kind of like consolidate those policies, and that's kind of point two, and amend them as needed to kind of capture some of the regional planning objectives and neighborhood planning objectives that have developed through recent work and some of the neighborhood plans development for Caronsmore and the University District. Also updating the policies to reflect some of the key issues. So looking at climate change, reconciliation, other kind of key policy elements that have emerged since the previous update. And then also updating regulations to reflect current planning best practices. Next slide, please. So this involved kind of a substantial background analysis, and this is the background study report, which is available on PlaySpeak. This required kind of the review of physical assets in terms of land use, the services, amenities, parks. Also looking at some market factors like growth and the economy, and that ties into some of the elements around housing and homelessness and other issues in the community. We also kind of did the cut on the planning principles, as well as connecting that back to some of the policy regulations in the zoning bylaw and neighborhood plans. So allowing us to kind of harmonize the OCP in a way that spoke to the other documents and the work that's been done by the city since the last update. Next slide. So we're going to walk through the draft vision and goals, and because we're such a small group, like feel free to chime in. Like we can keep this relatively informal, given that there's just 2 participants. So yeah, feel free to jump in. So we really, we liked a lot of the elements of the initial vision, but thought there was room to kind of build on that and elaborate on what was there. So the original vision was in the previous OCP was to be one of the most livable small towns in Canada. We've kind of evolved this a little bit to be Duncan is one of the most livable small towns in Canada, proudly serving economic and cultural heart of the Cowichan Valley, located in the traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. Duncan is a welcome, diverse, creative, environmentally, and resilient. So welcome to lend any thoughts to that, but we thought it was necessary to kind of elaborate on that vision a little bit and kind of add some context. So there's 8 goals in the original, so we've got 8 goals draft. I won't read through all these in detail, but take a look. And essentially, like for this first page, so there's a few more to come. There's managed growth. So, this is around, accommodating and managing population growth within the city and realizing that a lot of growth within the city will have to come through redevelopment. Pretty much all of it, given that Duncan is an urban community that is built out. The second goal is around thriving economy and business communities. So this spoke a lot to some of the changes over the last few years, not just due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but just an evolving commercial and service employment environment in Duncan, and really the opportunity to enhance Duncan as the center of the Cowichan Valley, and think about those things that the OCP can support in that role. And in that there's a lot of elements that work with land use and trying to actually create the space for further economic development going forward. Affordable and diverse housing. So looking through the housing projections and looking at the population growth and the needs of the community, there's definitely like many regions of the island, a housing shortage and essentially a housing crisis that's being experienced across our economy and our communities. So there's a push for increasing the amount of affordable housing and also diversifying the housing stock. Currently, there's large areas of Duncan that are single detached residential neighborhoods. There's a lot of room for infill, and there's a lot of policies that exist in the current OCP that actually support that. But we've attempted to take that a step further and actually think about where density can be included in some of those areas. Goal 4, responsible stewardship of the environment. So again, this is a key focus of any official community plan. Managing land use is actually looking at the environmental health of the community and how it adapts and changes and recognizes the impacts of climate change over time to the ecology of Duncan and the broader region. Sorry, my apologies, 7 goals. And the strong community connections. So we've heard through previous consultation and stakeholder engagements to date that there is a need to think about Duncan as itself within being one part of the region. This is a really important consideration given that North Cowichan Tribes, Cowichan Valley Regional District, they all surround Duncan, and they very much function as one entity, right? And Duncan, being the city, being the core, has a big role to play in that, and that's something that's being recognized, kind of across the OCP. Goal 6 is to have a well-serviced community, and this talks a lot to physical infrastructure, but also supporting that vibrant, connective economy, having the social, environmental, health, and safety built into that as well. Part of this too is also thinking about, the sustainability of financing and creating infrastructure as well. So there's a financial component that is addressed in the OCP. And then goal 7 is creating positive relationships with neighboring communities. Again, speaking that, similar to goal 5, but really, focusing on the relationships between Cowichan tribes, the CVRD, and the municipality of North Cowichan. Any questions? Just to kind of throw it out there. Excellent. All right. So draft policy directions. So we'll go to the next slide. There's, at a high level, one of the key purposes of an OCP is it's a land use bylaw. So its goal is to regulate land use and in a way, establish generalized future land use for the community of Duncan. This is looking at the current land use for the community and just kind of what are some of the uses there. And you can see there's generally a large amount of low density residential in the yellow, some high density residential in orange, medium, and kind of a lighter orange commercial and the pink, and the mixed use commercial and residential kind of looking at downtown and the Coronation area. So there's been some adjustments to this, and if Dan can go to the next slide. So one thing you'll notice that we now have 9 designations. So we've gotten a little more detailed in the land use designations piece. We've created the core commercial, which really looks at that mixed use mixed use multifamily and commercial kind of downtown core. And some of the kind of ideas behind this is to really encourage that population and settlement within the areas where you're having those commercial uses in order to kind of bring people to the space and create kind of the round the clock use of that space as well too. We've also expanded in some ways the core residential, and this is looking at basically higher density residential uses on the peripheral of downtown. So primarily within the Coronation downtown neighborhoods, as well as you can see a little bit next to the highway, back from kind of the gateway commercial, which is really a focus on increasing the usability, and this will tie into some of the conversation that Dan will dive into with the TMS, which is really thinking about this corridor as a gateway, and really trying to consolidate a lot of the properties in the space here in a kind of commercial gateway format. So this will allow for a significant amount of density, so up to 6 stories and potentially beyond. So there's some flexibility in it that some uses could go higher. And one of the key things we want to think about here is actually consolidating the number of accesses, creating a more pedestrian friendly environment along the highway, and hoping to shift some of the accesses towards the back. We've had some discussions with MOTI that suggest that there's some work to be done into actually how we coordinate with the province in implementing this. But that's really the opportunity that is identified for the highway corridor. I think there's a lot of opportunity to kind of improve the use and and utilization of this space. And this also lines up with, some of the preliminary information and work that's being done by Cowichan tribes and the neighbors too. So there's, again, we're looking kind of at 2 square kilometers within, a larger urban center. And a lot of this plan does recognize like what is happening on its boundaries. So when we look at the kind of the urban residential, which is the light orange, we also see that like there's a wide variation in density that is permitted within that designation. And it will allow for the opportunity to kind of reflect some of the density that we're seeing in the North Cowichan OCP on the border, just kind of to the north of the Marchmont area, where they are looking at kind of 4 to 6 story buildings. So that is possible in that urban residential, although the vision is looking for more of like the 4 kind of like low to medium density, and also a good chunk of the missing middle. In the neighborhood residential too, some of the changes that we've made, but kind of building on what the current OCP has is the ability to kind of have more densification of existing single detached family neighborhoods. And things like suites and carriage suites are already permitted in Duncan, but there's the opportunity for more missing middle, which would be like duplexes, townhouses, etc. So Dan, if actually maybe any questions at this point? Or yeah,
Well, Sean, I'll jump in as sort of an observer. And so for our attendees and anyone who watches the video later, to me, this is the OCP, right? And I really want to draw people's attention to this. The map tells the story, right? So the map has all the implications of the OCP, and hopefully it's supported by those looking at it. But really, this is where the OCP becomes real, right? So where will densification occur? And then what does that mean? And I think that's coming up on some subsequent slides. But what does that mean in terms of building heights and types of buildings and et cetera? So I just really want to take the opportunity to draw anyone's attention to this map and then the principles that I think will be coming. Yeah, this is it, right? This is the OCP. This is where it gets real. So in terms of providing feedback, this is where to start.
That's a great point, Brian, too. And I'll maybe switch screen sharing here, Dan, if that's okay. Then we can switch back. But I'm just going to pull up the designations themselves, for just knowing that Jen and Brittany are probably well versed in this, this type of information, so we can get a little more technical. Can everyone see my screen there? Screen 1. Can you see this?
Yep.
So this is, so speaking to Brian's point, this is really the meat and potatoes of the OCP, so to speak, right? And each of those designations that we're showing the map here has an associated building height and density, as well as permitted land uses. So the way the OCP functions is really the guiding document for the community. So it is the vision for the future. This vision is, actioned by the zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw is kind of what's happening on the ground today. So this is the justification to change the zoning, essentially, to permit these types of uses. So if you're in these different land use designations and you want to change the zoning that you currently have, this is the kind of supporting argument for what could happen in those spaces. And really, it's a pretty wide range. It's not a huge departure from what's actually in the OCP now. It's just been kind of maybe sussed out a little bit more, and by creating a couple extra designations, we've kind of more discreetly defined where we want to see that density and what it looks like. So there's a lot in here, but you can see that in a lot of these more core designations, which you see in the dark colors, we're looking at up to 6 stories, which is pretty substantial density. And then for the urban residential at light orange, like up to 4 and up to 2 FAR, which is basically the density of the the development of any particular lot could be basically double the size of that lot. So if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you could build 20,000 square feet worth of building. So there's also take in here, and this is like an important element. I mean, we can talk about this more. There's just a lot here, but if you're gonna like look and make some comments and you know, respond to PlaceSpeak or even directly to us, like this is definitely a good area to focus on.
Sean, is it possible for you to identify some of the key changes from the current OCP to what you're proposing here? Like, are there key spots where there's been change, or even on the map? Like, I know you've got some new designations here, but are there spots on the map that are like really changing, or areas where you've really identified like this wasn't really high density, but now we want to move it in that direction? Can you identify some of those spots?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we go back to the map, Dan, if you've got your presentation up there still, we'll kind of switch gears here. And I can we can flip between the two a little bit. So I can pull the presentation up as well, actually.
Looks like I need you to stop sharing so I can share.
Right. It's a little bit of a picky program.
Okay.
So kind of looking at the proposed versus the current land use, you know, one of the things that we've done in this is the downtown is really like the mixed use, right? And there's opportunity for mixed use, like in a lot of areas here. You'll see little elements of purple, especially around Carensmore, where we have this neighborhood commercial. So that's something that's been expanded on. We've also kind of added a bit to Marchmont. So this is allowing for kind of more commercial and higher densities and some of what we refer to kind of the neighborhood centers of Duncan. I think the other major shift would be the highway kind of gateway commercial piece. So this is really kind of redirecting this towards higher density, more office, more commercial space, even potentially, you know, some residential commercial mixed use, which hasn't really been envisioned in this area to date. Although the kind of like the, so Dan, if you go up to the current one, you can see there is some kind of consistency in these. So the changes are relatively minor. I think overall we are envisioning like a slight increase in density in most areas. If we go back down, Dan, you can see we've kind of more discreetly defined kind of where we want to see the core residential versus like some of the commercial or the neighborhood commercial. So yeah, there's a lot of small changes across the board, and it'd be hard to kind of walk through each one of them. But that's kind of the general, you know, changes that we've been looking at through the OCP.
The other big change was the high density area kind of north of Trunk Road in the original plan got redesignated to the new designation, which is urban residential, which looks at more kind of that missing middle household style. So it's still a higher form of density, but it was just a kind of a name change. That's another major one you'll see. That's that darker orange on the current one. And then that got changed to the lighter orange.
Yeah, that's a good point, Matt. Yeah, that's a really good one for sure. Yeah, so that's kind of the density lift that is kind of happening through this OCP.
And then there's a change, there are changes in the floor heights and area ratios, right? Is that really where the densification's coming?
Yeah, so I mean, 6 stories is yeah, the maximum density, and that's been applied in a wider area than it was previously. So there's higher building heights and higher densities than what the current OCP permits. And this is again kind of thinking about Duncan as the core, you know, within an urban center in Cowichan, and that, you know, the existing, you know, low density residential areas have a lot of opportunity to be used more efficiently in terms of land use.
How about commercial space? I know vacancy rates are very low in the city right now. Are you opening up more space for that type of development through like the mixed use and all of that? Is that like percentage wise, is that increasing or?
Yeah, it would be increasing. It's very permissive. I would argue that the current OCP actually also permits a ton of commercial, you know, in a lot of the areas currently. So the question comes down to redevelopment and, you know, when that's happening. So it's one of the things that is, you know, we've deliberated through this is that, you know, it's how do you want to support the development that you want to see? How do you want to see good development? And development that does provide amenities like, you know, more commercial space. And that is a supply and demand, an economic question, as I'm sure you're aware, Brittany. But you know, it's kind of like if you build it, they will come. But you know, I think this provides a lot of opportunities to build that space. One of the challenges Duncan has that we identified is that there's a lot of small lots in its commercial areas. So the need to, you know, consolidate and redevelop parcels is more challenging for development. Having larger kind of pre-existing commercial parcels makes it easier for that transition to happen, which is why the gateway commercial use, I think, is a good opportunity for the city to realize some of those bigger commercial entities if they're, you know, if there's the will for that. But yeah, it will be a little challenging to consolidate those lots in the downtown to see major commercial redevelopment.
In terms of the changing and increasing the different land uses, is that at all to kind of work on some of the affordable housing situations by kind of combining them with the commercial stuff? Like, is that the major, by kind of looking at, you know, putting the land use as commercial and then having the residential suites upstairs? Is that kind of where you're going with kind of incorporating a lot of kind of combining those two zones, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a good amount of density permitted across the board. Again, it kind of comes down to supply and demand and the redevelopment. There's a huge demand for housing, obviously, everywhere on the island. So the density increasing the density in some of these areas will hopefully allow for, you know, developers or homeowners to, like, you know, increase the amount of housing on each of these lots. So especially when we look at the yellow here, the neighborhood residential, where we're looking at primarily single attached lots. Many will have suites. Most probably won't have carriage houses, but there's some. You know, being able to have things like duplexes and carriage houses on all of these, you know, is you know, potential for incremental, you know, development of housing. The urban residential, the light orange, you know, going up to 4 stories, having, you know, townhouses, low rises, the missing middle. There's a real opportunity there to kind of fill in, you know, what we'd call low end of market housing. So not heavily subsidized housing, but like the opportunity for things that are more affordable, like a 4-plex or a townhouse, things like that. So you can see how, like, a tremendous amount of land in Duncan and in this OCP would be dedicated towards that. And it is too already. The OCP itself actually already permits a lot of these things. So yeah, it's a matter of kind of in the market and incentivizing that type of development too. And, you know, there's some points in the OCP too about how you know, development approvals and other things could potentially be streamlined if they're well aligned with the official community plan. So we talk about things like parking variances and, you know, establishing clear community amenity contribution policies. So these are things that a lot of communities struggle with because they're trying to, you know, go through the development process and, you know, negotiating every community amenity or one-off. There's a lot of challenges that can kind of sometimes create, you know, the procedure itself can take longer. So I think there's identified some opportunities to kind of help that process forward, and the land base certainly is like asking for that type of use as well.
Are you guys considering any type of density bonusing for provision of affordable units or anything like that? Has that been talked about, or is that like, am I jumping too far ahead there?
No, well, density bonusing is something that is actually kind of executed by the zoning bylaw rather than the official community plan. So
Right.
the official community plan is supportive of density bonusing and other tools like that. So it would give the city the ability to implement density bonusing as needed, in a lot of these areas. So again, we're kind of like at the 10,000 foot level. The zoning bylaw is more like the action of this, right? So some of the policies will come through that.
Our existing zoning bylaw does have zoning density or bonus density built into some of the zones. The downtown commercial one especially has those mechanisms already built in. The existing floor area ratio in the zoning bylaw is a little bit lower than what the new official community plan is proposing. So we may have to make amendments to kind of bring those in line with each other, but those mechanisms definitely exist already.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Matt, too. And yeah, typically following an OCP, there are some tweaks that happen with the zoning bylaw as well, and so, some will come through future applications too. Excellent. Dan, if you want to move on to the next slides here. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. There's a lot of information. We still have to talk about the TMS, and I know it's 7 o'clock. So just jump in, throw your hand up. Does everyone know how to raise their hand in Zoom? So there's the reactions button at the bottom. So just throw your hand up and I'll jump in. But if I'm going through this quickly, it's just let me know and I'll elaborate on some of the points. So for growth management, the key objectives here are really to effectively directly influence the rate of growth, ensure development respects the infrastructure capacity of the city, physical capacity of local ecosystems and community livability, balance between growth and development and having that community fabric. Only permit development as outlined in the land use designations. So again, the table I showed you is really what we're looking for in each of those designations. And again, to encourage sustainable, high quality development enhances the benefits to the community, meets the needs of residents. So the goal here is really to incentivize good development and discourage bad development. So housing, recognizing, again, we've talked about a couple of times now, it's like housing is a critical issue in the city of Duncan, and it's a fundamental part of community health and livability. So it's again creating those opportunities for diverse housing types and those that benefit different household sizes and incomes and lifestyles and different age groups and abilities. And again, too, this comes down to diversifying housing tenure and density and kind of flexibility in land use is something that would support that. So economic development. So again, this OCP really puts Duncan at the heart of the Cowichan Valley, and I think that speaks a lot to the vision as a whole. And really think about Duncan as a role as business hub in the CVRD, and looking to create a business friendly atmosphere, looking to support small businesses, to link and align Duncan's environmental, social, and cultural goals with the growth in the tax base. So also making sure that new development and future growth comes with those amenities and comes with amenities that support economic development and a diverse and creative community. And again, allowing for diverse employment opportunities too. So this speaks to kind of expanding that commercial opportunities for commercial uses and things like that. And there's actually a greater flexibility in the types of community use, commercial uses that would be considered in the city as well. For different areas. So transportation, Dan will elaborate on this in great detail, but it's essentially to create a balanced and efficient, sustainable transportation network that provides improvements to walking, cycling, and transit. So, Dan can speak about the kind of the hierarchy of transportation, but really prioritizing the sustainable and kind of human-focused modes of transportation. And again, creating those connections, establishing where those destinations are and making connection between them. And one of the key things we talked about too is the connectivity across the highway corridor being kind of a key idea. So natural environment. So looking to maintain, improve local land, water, and air and energy resources for future generations. Ensure this environmentally sensitive features of the community are protected. So this is covered a lot in the development permit areas, which there's one for environment, natural environment, and basically sensitive ecosystems, as well as like, restricting development in areas where there's potential for natural hazards. So there's been some updated information around flooding and other natural hazards in the community that is, talked about in the OCP. There's a need to update the city's flood management bylaw to reflect some of these, but the OCP will be supportive of that, and again, directing development away from those areas that have high risk of being impacted by natural hazards. And then identifying and protecting where possible the native habitat, plant species, water courses, bird nesting sites, things like that. So climate change, adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. So, the City of Duncan has done some great work on this front in terms of looking at their citywide greenhouse gas emissions and how those can be reduced. This is strongly connected to the work being done in the TMS as well, and kind of looking at overall energy consumption, limiting those impacts as well. Within the development permit areas, as well as the OCP, there's some guidance around land use, site planning, and building design to encourage kind of greener, more sustainable development, as well as the potential to create more renewable energy sources and reduce kind of the reliance on carbon intensive energy, as well as collaborating across jurisdictions. So there's a number of climate change strategies and work that's being done across the CDRD. So coordinating that work, and I know the City of Duncan has worked hard to kind of collaborate with its neighbors on this front as well, and that's spoken to in both the OCP and the TMS. So arts, culture, and heritage. So this is, there's some really interesting conversations that we've had through the development of the OCP, and the stakeholder sessions had some good representatives from the local kind of arts and culture community, and thinking about how the city as a center for arts and culture in the Cowichan Valley can have some, really important economic benefits, as well as some recreation and community livability benefits. So really building on the assets that exist and looking to kind of grow those as time goes on. Strengthening the city's relationship with Cowichan tribes has been an important comment, and something that's discussed even in the key goals of the official community plan and the vision itself. So increasing bridges of diversity and cultural understanding, and to enhance the distinct identity of the city by protecting its heritage resources, as well as the built and natural environment, and where those opportunities present to preserve the archaeological and architectural heritage of the city as well. Parks, open space, and recreation. So Duncan is, again, a very urban space, and there's a lot of opportunity to kind of build upon the park and open space resources that it has. This is actually a really important consideration as density occurs in the city. So creating more density without creating those outdoor spaces, those parkland refuges for people to experience is going to be kind of an important trade-off. So as the city densifies, there's going to be the need to kind of one, either expand the existing parkland as it is, or improve it to make it more usable or have more benefits for the community. So this part of the OCP really looks at utilizing all the tools, development cost charges, community mandate contributions to acquire more parkland, identify areas where park space can be built upon, and the benefits of expanding versus improving parkland, or both. So these are spaces that are essential to the city's character, and it'll be important to kind of balance the need for open space with new development. Next slide. Infrastructure and servicing. So it's important that whatever's being done, this future development is well serviced and supported by the current infrastructure in the city. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to actually enhance how infrastructure is being paid for, and understanding that whatever is built needs to be adequately serviced. And there's the need to also ensure that there's accessibility and greater, ways to improve the infrastructure, not just create greater community livability. And this again talks to TMS, and they need to kind of create and expand pedestrian spaces and look at more sustainable modes of transportation. But it's also encouraging spaces in the city to be accessible for people with differently abled people of different genders and abilities to actually utilize the space effectively. But yeah, then there's kind of the keeping the lights on piece, making sure there's adequate sewer and water to service that development as well. And I'll pass it back to Dan. Is there actually, maybe there's any questions? We can just kind of open it up on, and that's like the OCP is a very long document with hundreds of policies. So, that's kind of our, tip of the iceberg, I guess.
Maybe Dan, you'll cover this, but what's the plan for parking for all this new density? I know you guys have like floodplain situations and underground parking isn't really a thing. So what's the plan?
I mean, I'll jump in there. I think that's a very pointed question and a really good segue maybe between OCP and TMS. I think honestly, it's a dual, it's both land use and land use regulation, which I think you're getting at, as well as, and that's, we'll say, the provision of parking for future development sites, as well as the management and provision of public parking resource. And so, not to overcomplicate it, but I think it actually dually lives in both treatment of land use policy and land use regulation, as well as in how we manage public asset. At the OCP level, there's, I mean, Sean, maybe jump in, but in terms of like policy level guidance on parking, whether private associated with future development or public related to management and supply of public resource?
Yeah, so I mean, the OCP does speak to like, there's a need for parking, but parking, and Dan can speak to this too. It's a very like, it's supply and demand question. Parking has a huge impact on transportation behavior, period. You create it, people use it. If you limit it, people are forced to think of other modes of transportation. There's support in the official community plan for parking variances, and essentially what that means is that urban developments that are looking to redevelop current spaces in the city potentially could have lower parking requirements than what's required by zoning to facilitate a development that may benefit from its location being closer to services, maybe requiring less vehicle trips, being able to access transit, cycling facilities, etc. So, I mean, that's really the trade-off. Parking is there's minimum parking requirements in the zoning bylaw, and it's kind of how do you balance the need for parking with the goal of supporting alternative modes of transportation. It's a fine balance, and I know Dan knows this one very well. I think it's too just kind of utilizing that space effectively. So we do encourage underground parking in the OCP where it's feasible, and that's a key word. Feasible given the floodplain location. Some places it's going to be feasible, other places and many areas probably not. So whether this is incorporated within the structure itself, so there's other designs other than underground parking that can yield to efficient parking structures that would be within the building, or potentially even separate facilities, but those can be expensive to build, and there really has to be a huge demand to get to that point too.
Now, maybe Brittany, if I could pose a question on your question, is did you have any thoughts specific to parking, whether it's land use policy, land use regulation, or whether it's the more public component? Like, was there a route to your question there in terms of what you'd like to see in terms of parking?
Not really. Although, we've talked in the office a couple times about car sharing and trying to attract maybe Moto or one of those types of companies to the area. And I know they work with developers often. in larger centers. So, we've talked about that type of thing before, but yeah, I don't know if there wasn't like a specific solution I had in mind, but maybe I'll park my question until after the TMS discussion, because I'm sure that will bring a lot of new information into the space as well.
Oh, and I'll follow up on that. So within the sort of the scope of the TMS that we're undertaking, we are considering more specific to downtown, but downtown parking management. But now the material I'm going to work through in the next little bit here is actually very light on downtown parking. So happy to maybe elaborate on that, in the absence of PowerPoint material here, but happy to elaborate on some of the what's behind the scenes, and we're working toward producing a draft TMS in the not too distant future. So happy to elaborate on what's coming forward as part of that.
Great, thank you.
And I can just add what we currently are doing and probably will be doing moving forward, just with regards to parking variances, is the city will be basically having a consultant perform a traffic impact assessment and parking study to see what the appropriate level of parking, what it should be for the property given its location and proximity to alternative transportation methods. And that's something that we're going to be doing probably for quite a while moving forward. So I think that will help address some of those areas where maybe there isn't a need for parking in that specific development, but other developments might need additional parking. So help create those kind of solutions on its own, just doing those studies.
Okay. Well, if we're all covered on the official community plan component, I'm happy to shift gears and move toward the transportation mobility strategy. We have a number of slides following this one here that we wanted to provide an overview of sort of the framework of the TMS and some of the key network suggestions and proposals that have been identified through this process. I will emphasize all of this is very much in draft form. And the point of presenting this is to get input and either confirmation or otherwise, and really sort of refine the work that's been produced so far to make sure that when we get down to, in a matter of months, developing the formal draft TMS document, that it's something that has gone through a process of being vetted and refined and gets to the point that we've got general support for it. So really what I intend to present here is very much in draft, and really keen to hear feedback from the group here. So some of this can be fairly basic, but we do find actually some of these framework components to be quite important in terms of through a transportation master plan or a transportation mobility strategy like this, we end up getting quite detailed. And we need to make sure that when we talk about specific intersections, there's specific components of sidewalks or public transit or whatnot, that all of this is considered through a sort of a broader framework and under a vision and a series of objectives that clearly articulate how we go from sort of broadly where the city and the broader community is looking to go into the future, and how some of these more immediate term actions align with that. So while some of the language that's on the screen here can seem quite kind of high level and broad, it is actually very important in terms of framing up some of the more detailed proposals and recommendations that come out of a plan like this. So I might not narrate this entire vision statement, but what's on the screen in front of us is what's been drafted up, and we've had the opportunity to test it a little bit through some of our early engagement so far as a vision statement. And so the vision statement is meant to articulate, and please do sort of either read through line by line or pick up some of the key pieces. But the vision statement really is to articulate what Duncan looks like and what traveling around Duncan, what the experience is upon successful implementation of the TMS. And so it's a sort of a forward-looking articulation of what conditions are like in the future. So some of the key components, and I took the liberty of bolding some of the key functional components of this. The city's transportation network supports mobility for all. It is multimodal, and it's both enjoyable and functional. It supports a shift. This piece is probably very important. It supports a shift toward active and sustainable transportation. And also important that people of all ages and abilities have convenient, safe, and accessible transportation options. And so we do go deeper with this, but generally some of the items that are bolded and featured here are some of the kind of the key guiding components to this. I'll shift next onto the 6 discrete goals that have been identified. And so in no particular order, they're around design. And so this plan is going to queue up investment in infrastructure. And so it is important that those investments are made in a way that they support multimodal movement and complete destinations for all travel modes. And so moving away from sort of vehicular oriented investments and toward a more multimodal and complete street approach. Sustainability. And so investment through the TMS is to reduce transportation related emissions and environmental impacts related to the transportation network. Character. So again, very aligned very closely with the OCP is that Duncan has great existing character, and what we do here in terms of building out TMS and the networks is to build upon that, not conflict with it, but actually build and enhance on it. Collaboration, using transportation network as an opportunity to collaborate with other service providers in adjacent jurisdictions, so whether that's service providers like BC Transit and the CBRD and the transit system, or adjacent jurisdictions that might have jurisdiction over trails and sidewalk networks and roadways, such as the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, the province, or the CBRD, or Cowichan tribes. Well, we don't have numbers here, but another one would be around investment. So making balanced and equitable investments. The idea being that we are strategic with how we invest money and make sure that it is spent in a way that it builds infrastructure that appeals to a broad portion of the community. And then also around bottom left is around connections. And so this one's quite important, is that we provide connections within the community as well as beyond the community, and then in support of some of the land use planning that's been set out in the directions for that as well. So 6 key goals, those again, fully working draft, but we've worked them through a bit of a process so far, and there's actually been a refinement so far to get to what you see on the screen in front of you. We also find it important through this that, vision is one thing, goals, okay, that articulates what we're trying to achieve here, but then some key principles that underpin all of what we're doing. And this is where some of the higher level framework type pieces start to get more tangible in terms of how they might impact the community and transportation specifically. And so there's 4 that I want to highlight here, and please don't, we don't need to go word for word here, but I think the 4 key principles are around modal hierarchy. And so the triangle diagram at the top right of the screen is the suggested order of hierarchy in terms of how investment and how thinking around planning and design and even development review and approval might consider transportation. So working from highest priority to lowest priority goes from walking, cycling, transit, goods movement, multiple occupant vehicles, and then finally single occupant vehicles. So this isn't to say one mode always wins out over the other mode. It's to say that in every planning, every design, every decision that comes forward, we give due consideration to each of the travel modes, and where compromise and trade-off is needed, we refer to the modal hierarchy to inform those conversations. Another one, all ages and abilities. So this idea that AAA is the acronym, and we will see it a little bit when the draft transportation mobility strategy is released. The idea behind AAA is that investments that are made in infrastructure are done so in a way that they appeal to a broad spectrum of the population, whether that's like folks of all ages, all abilities, whether physical, cognitive, visual, sensory, etc., when we build facilities that work for people of all abilities, it works for everyone in between. So, and really in our world, designing for all ages and abilities really is just good design. And so we want to make sure that everything that is built works from a AAA perspective. Land use integration, I feel like we may have touched on this already, but it underpins the TMS. This is very, we've done these in other communities, transportation plans. What is particularly appealing about this instance is the work we're doing here is directly tied to the land use and community planning, the work that's done through the OCP. And so we do really want to talk about how we build out these TMS networks that I'm going to touch on in a minute here, and how they're directly related to some of the growth and land use planning that's happening through the OCP. And then lastly, complete streets. And so this is an approach to building out streets and building out supporting active transportation infrastructure that really uses investment and improvements in streets, in roadways, in the public space that lives between property edge and property edge, and thinking about it holistically to make sure that we use opportunities to make investments in those spaces where maybe conventionally or traditionally that's been more vehicle focused, we think more broadly. And so that means not only other travel modes, public transit, active transportation, parking, et cetera, but also broader community objectives, whether that's environmental sustainability, whether it's creating social spaces and placemaking opportunities. We think very broadly about investment in road rights of way and making sure they're not simply just roads and facilitating traffic. So these are core principles. So we went from a broad vision statement that describes Duncan in the future once the TMS has been built out. We have very clear goals that guide the work that we're doing through this plan. And we have principles, again, that kind of underpin all of the decision makings, not only for this document and this process, but for reference in future when planning, design, and decision making is being done. We come back and reference these principles to make sure the work that's being undertaken is aligned with what was set out here. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit from sort of the broad overarching framework into some more specifics. I'm going to work through walking and rolling network, cycling network, public transit, and then finally complete streets. With each, I'm going to welcome, there's more detail here, so I'm going to welcome maybe and we'll check our time as we go here, but a pause on each of these if there's any more. This is some of the most detail you will have seen yet. So if there's any more specific questions on specific locations or pieces of infrastructure or gaps and challenges or opportunities, I'd very much welcome that. Okay, so we'll start first with the walking and rolling network. And so what's shown on the screen in front of us, and very much in draft, working draft, and very interested in feedback. So what we're seeing in front of us, the map on the right-hand side of the screen, is showing both existing sidewalks. So existing sidewalks are shown in the solid teal, I guess it is. And then future sidewalks shown in the dashed yellowy orange. And so what's shown as existing obviously is what's on the ground right now. It's not an indication of condition necessarily, but it's an indication of the presence of sidewalks. And then what's shown in the dashed yellow is per guiding policy is major roads. So that being our obviously the highway corridor, and then some of our major streets and our connector streets, some of our busier roads in town. The direction being we want to see sidewalks on both sides of those roads. So what's shown on the map is either where those exist or dashed yellow where we'd like to see a sidewalk on maybe the other side of a major road where they don't currently exist. The same rings true for downtown streets. The policy guidance is that we want to see sidewalks on both sides of all downtown streets. What we're also seeing is on local streets and residential streets, typically in neighborhoods, whether it's over in the Marchman area or up Cairnsmore area, we're seeing a good number of streets that have sidewalks in place already on at least one side, which is great. And what's highlighted with the dash yellow is locations where that might not be the case. And we as part of the long-term build of the network, want to see sidewalk on at least one side of the street. So that's really the kind of the key feature of the map shown here is the dash yellow, or the proposed future sidewalk build out. Now, what we've also done, and this is really where I'd love to hear what the group has to say, is around the letter codes. And so what we've done is highlighted some of the segments that we believe to be, from what we've heard and then what we've seen ourselves and what existing policy might suggest, is where some of the what we're calling priority projects or priority improvements might be. And so they're letter coded from A to I suppose, in no particular order, but generally working from east to west. And the goal there is really that those would be the focus of investment, whether that's capital planned investment, whether that's development contributed investment, or whether that's investment that might be achieved through grants and external funds. But those would be the priority of the shorter term build out of this network. And so you start to see some of them at the very far end of Warrencliffe, where it doesn't quite connect currently to the peripheral trail. Sidewalks on Marchment, where again in the far east end they don't necessarily connect, and there's some bus stops on that stretch of road that are currently without waiting pads and sidewalks. We start to see a few others over in and around downtown, Ingram, Evans Street, and Duncan Street as well. So kind of really curious the group's feedback on those. If anything, you're feeling like one of these is particularly important over the others, or if there's others you feel that might belong on this priority list that aren't currently being shown.
Dan, what's going on at D? That's on the highway, right?
Yeah.
Around- yeah. Is that proposed maybe new pedestrian crossing?
Yes. So there's, I mentioned it very briefly, and no fault of yours for not picking up on it. There's a highway corridor, Trans-Canada Highway Corridor Management Plan that's in place that is sort of co-authored or co-owned by the city as well as the province, North Cowichan, I think Cowichan tribes as well. And the improvement for that location is a pedestrian half signal. And so that is, if you can picture it, blinking green lights on the highway, and then no lights on the side street. But as a pedestrian, if you show up, you can press the button and those lights will go red on the highway and give you the opportunity to get across. And so I call it a pedestrian half signal, and has cyclist benefit as well. It also has minor benefit for vehicles on the side street to allow them gaps in the highway to sneak out as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that's identified in the corridor plan and something we want to bring forward as part of this. Good question, good point, good pickup. Okay, so there's a lot there. I'd encourage you to kind of, we have a survey live on the web right now. I'd encourage you to kind of stew on this a little bit and go away. If anything comes to mind, please provide feedback that way. Shifting gears into cycling network. So similar kind of approach to the cycling network here. I think the difference is with the walking and rolling network, it was primarily sidewalks with consideration of trails. With the cycling network, we've gone to the extent of actually not just identifying cycling routes, but identifying the types of treatments that might be applied to those cycling routes. And so on, say, some of the more minor low traffic volume, low traffic speed streets, a shared treatment, bicycle sharing the roadway with vehicles might be appropriate, because those cars there's not very many of them and they're traveling slowly. We've identified some of those, and so those are shown in the dashed blue. So you start to see a bit of that up in Cairnsmore and primarily down in Marchment. And then on the more major roads where continuous cycling treatments are sought, we're seeing, well, what's being proposed as part of the plan is either painted bike lanes or fully protected bike lanes, which the distinction on the fully protected component, and this is admittedly new for Duncan, is that these would be spaces that are not only dedicated spaces for cyclists, it's a dedicated space that then has physical protection between where vehicles travel and where cyclists travel. And so it's an elevated treatment. It's reserved primarily for your busiest and highest speed routes where that protection is truly needed. And care and consideration has been given with the map that's in front of us to providing continuous cycling routes. So a cycling route's not much benefit if it doesn't get you from downtown to the, the IU, to the schools, to the parks, whatever. So continuous routes is important, but then also we've done our best to identify routes that, as possible, provide alternatives to traveling on busy roads. And so that's what we see in front of us. And so some of the existing facilities are shown in solid lines, and there's only a limited number. And then some of the proposed future are shown in the dashed. And so maybe a couple, again, similar to the walking and rolling map, we've identified what we are proposing as priority projects, the investments or the improvements that would be made first. And so again, with letter codes, and maybe some of the more prominent ones include Coronation Avenue. So basically a continuous east-west corridor where the intersection on the east with Trunk Road happens, across the highway, working its way across the rail line into downtown, and eventually kind of teeing up on the east or the west side of downtown with Government. So that being kind of a key east-west corridor. And the thinking there being that in order to connect east and west Duncan and then sort of beyond into North Cowichan and Cowichan tribes, you need to get across the highway. And so the feeling being that the crossing at Coronation is a better opportunity to do that as a cyclist than the crossing at Trunk Road would be. And so then this key east-west corridor really hinges on this Coronation Avenue corridor as the best way to get across the highway and between downtown and east and west Duncan. A couple others identified, multi-use pathway along Canada Ave, some neighborhood bikeways, some kind of quick win type projects over in Marchmont on Warncliffe and I think north-south around Beach, I think it is. And then a multi-use pathway on Jubilee Street working its way up the hill and toward Cairnsmore. So maybe I'll pause there. Any thoughts or any items you'd like to pick up on here? Okay. I will also add that it's about 6 or 7 years old now, but the city did undertake a active transportation plan process in about, I think it was 2015. And so much of this is directly related to some of the network planning that was established through that document. We've kind of taken it away and refined it based on more multimodally how it might coordinate with how the road network might be treated, as well as land use and through the official community plan.
Can I just ask a quick question about the bicycle parking improvement that you have located downtown?
Absolutely.
That would be, yeah, okay. What is the major plan for that in that area, I guess? Because there's just lots of parking in general there, but I'm not so much in the biking end of things.
Yeah, so the goal there is around where a lot of the downtown origin or destination buses stop and start, is to provide an opportunity for folks who might not be on necessarily the key routes to bike, to ride in, park their bike, not in a bike rack, but something more substantive where they feel, especially if they have an e-bike or something that might be a little more costly, that they feel comfortable and safe that, their bike will be there at the end of the day when they return. So it's really around multimodal connecting and making sure that we can sort of broaden out the range that people are able to travel in to access public transit, not just walking, but making it suitable and comfortable for cycling as well.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that.
Of course. And I should say it also, like, the location that, and this is conceptual, but the location that we've identified is really focused around like the core downtown bus stop interchange location. It also has appeal for downtown commuters where if their place of work doesn't necessarily have appropriate cycling facilities, this might be an opportunity to them as well. Okay, well, I'm going to skip forward to public transit. And so what I wanted to kind of lead in here with is that the focus of the work that we're doing is really on the transit infrastructure. And so that's really what you're seeing on the map here is around bus stops, locations, bus stop enhancements. There is a parallel initiative happening at so obviously the Cowichan Valley system extends well beyond just the city of Duncan borders. And so there is a region-wide, valley-wide process happening right now about visioning what some of the 5-year actions might be around transit routing and transit service. And so the work we're doing here is not meant to dictate that work. It's quite the opposite. It's meant to kind of reflect it and pick up on it, and then focus in on how the infrastructure that's within the city's boundaries can feed into that and help support some of the service and route planning enhancements. And so what's shown here is all of the bus stop locations that have all been identified in the circles. And then we've identified where some of the either current amenities are in place or where some of the enhancements might be suggested. And so it's coming through quite faint on my screen, but the locations with the yellow halo around it are some where improvements are suggested. Others have basic amenities in place. We're very light on bus shelters within Duncan. Something else to consider, but in terms of basic amenities like sidewalk connections and curb ramps that allow people to get up and down from sidewalks to get onto bus stops, that's where a lot of the focus has been placed. Okay, and then lastly, I'll skip forward to what we're calling the complete street network. And so there's actually a fair bit. We've intentionally simplified this to be digestible and sort of focused on what the action might be, but there's actually a fair bit of work that went into this. And so the information that's on the map, we're seeing road classifications. So each street gets a classification, and that each classification then gets some descriptors on how many vehicles are intended to be on there, the balance of moving vehicles versus complete street activities and active transportation, and things like that, so that we can start to make sense out of how streets are meant to function more broadly within the network. And then when decisions need to be made around planning and design of specific streets, we can refer back to these criteria as kind of a basis for how the street's intended to function. And so we see obviously the highway, which is shown in the bold red. We see major roads, so these being Government and Trunk, as well as Canada Ave. These are kind of, a highway is under the province's jurisdiction. And so while it has a very significant influence over travel and kind of the experience more broadly within the city, it is the province's jurisdiction. The Trunk Road, Government, and Canada are your most major roads under the city's jurisdiction. They're shown in blue. Connector roads are kind of the next classification of street. There's a whole handful of those, but Coronation, Jubilee, Cairnsmore, Marchmont, those are sort of your more sort of downtown or neighborhood level streets, but they're still pretty important in the overall network. And then we've identified both local streets, which are the bulk of your more minor streets, as well as laneways have been flagged as well. And so that is important in future decision making and making sure that these streets function the way they were sort of intended to function. The network will work if they function the way they're meant to, and so future decisions will be made based on these classifications. And the other thing that's shown here, and these are the darker gray wheels that are shown on the select number of intersections. These are really around identifying where some of those, again, those priority improvements might be. And so we've gone through an exercise in testing how the bulk of the major intersections in town currently perform, and then also how they're going to perform in future in terms of both local sort of growth and the traffic that comes with it, as well as valley-wide growth, and then how they travel to and from the downtown. We've also reviewed safety and design and geometric performance to see where locations might either have a recorded and a proven collision history, or design that we believe might lend itself to being an unsafe condition, either traffic focused and or multimodally. And so the results of that are shown in these gray wheels. And these have been identified as what we're proposing to be the highest priority improvements that the city and partners would pursue in terms of improving the road network. And so I won't necessarily go through all of them, but you can see them highlighted generally from I guess northwest to.
Dan, do you want to just give a couple examples, like
Yeah.
Canada Ave there?
Yeah, I think
Coronation maybe.
sure. So I think good prompt. I think the Canada Ave government and sort of broader location there have been flagged with two separate intersections. So the Canada Ave government, and then the where Allenby, or I guess it's Craig Street at that point, ties in with Government Street. And so there's been some previous technical study done here that sort of helped us arrive at this, is that turn restrictions at at Craig and Government would help that intersection flow more freely. And then at the Canada and Government intersection, it's both a sort of a challenge of the sheer volume of traffic that moves through there, as well as some of the pre-existing design that probably deserves some more modernization to more clearly delineate how certain turns are meant to be made, and to have there's a crossing there that is 2 stages currently, and so we see that being made more simple, as well as shortening that crossing distance so that pedestrians feel and are more safe making that crossing. So that's a big one. On Coronation Avenue, I touched on this earlier. So letters H, I, and J, I suppose, on the map are referring to key intersections along Coronation. And so we want to feature Coronation both as a sort of a secondary east-west route, secondary to trunk, but recognizing that there's a large demand for traffic between downtown and points to the west, as well as the highway. But then also recognizing Coronation's importance in the cycling network, and making sure that improvements that are made to the corridor and at the intersection level are genuinely multimodal. And so we've investigated a little further than what shows just on the map here, in terms of ways that we can achieve protected cycling facilities on this corridor, as well as upgrade those intersections so that traffic can flow more freely. I think another one I wanted to highlight was just the highway corridor. And so the distinction here, and we have some dashed lines around those circles, those, and I touched on this earlier, those intersections are formally under the province's jurisdiction. And so the city's influence is as like a collaborating partner, but the final decision is made at the provincial level. But we wanted to consider those in terms of how they contribute to the more localized city network. And so, and again, this previous highway corridor plan in place, the location L, so down where L, Wilson Grove and Cowichan Way tees in just north of the bridge. Shorter term, that's identified as a pedestrian half signal like I talked about. And then longer term, the potential for full signalization. Now that would likely be some ways off, but the idea being there that as the highway continues to get more busy and traffic volumes continue to increase in future on some of the side streets, that we need to create gaps in that highway traffic so that the side streets can get in and out. Similarly, at Trunk and Coronation, obviously those are established always traffic signals. And so really it's about, we want to really create a balance here of how do we try and move vehicles through more effectively while not negatively impacting, say, crossing conditions of the highway. Pedestrian crossing of the highway is, we were told in our phase 1 engagement, that's a very important and critical issue for folks in town. And so we want to make sure that anything that happens in these locations is not taking away from that. If anything, it's enhancing the ability to get across the highway. And so similar type treatments identified for both Trunk and Coronation locations. I think the distinction with the Coronation location is, again, wanting to emphasize the importance of that as an east-west cycling corridor and what we can do to get cyclists across there effectively, but also safely and comfortably. So I'll pause on this one. We're near the end in terms of material to show off. So I'll pause here if any kind of questions on the complete street network. Okay, this is great. Okay, so I think we wanted to, and we have a few more minutes left, and we don't need to necessarily fill it, but I think for both the OCP review as well as the TMS, we just wanted to highlight what our next steps are and what you can expect to see as these roll out in draft form. So I will pass it back to Sean for the OCP.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, so just a quick overview of next steps for the OCP. So we have phase 2 of the consultation. The survey in Place Speak opened on February 14th and will be open until March 14th. We're hoping to do an update to Cowichan Tribes on the 21st of March. This will be a presentation to their lands committee. And then based on the input from the community feedback, we're going to look to update the OCP with the idea of kind of having a revised draft by the end of March, at which point we'll return to the advisory planning committee that's been supporting kind of and advising the OCP project team on April 7th as a preliminary date. And then from there, we're hoping to bring the bylaw forward to council to kind of share our final OCP. Then we'll conduct the external referrals. So for the OCP process, we're required to refer out to a number of other agencies and ministries in order to kind of just get that final confirmation. So that'll be done kind of April to June. Public hearing, no determined date yet, but aiming for kind of June of 2022, and then final plan adoption should happen shortly after that, if everything goes to plan.
Okay, and then specific to the TMS, a similar type outlook for the next little while. We're in the midst of consultation activities right now. We have a survey that's active that'll be closed in a couple weeks' time. Similar presentation in late March to Cowichan Tribes. We have produced, as part of our background work, a working paper #1, for lack of a better title. We will be producing a working paper #2, which really contains a lot of the network material that I just shared with the group, as well as supporting design guidance. So when we say it's a connector street, for example, it'll also describe what a connector street looks like and how it functions. So that material will be coming out in the not too distant future. It'll also encapsulate what we heard through this second round of engagement. We'll be checking in with council through April to kind of get a temperature check on where the technical activities and sort of the bones for the TMS document sit. And then we'll be working later through April to formally create and issue a draft TMS document. There will be a third round of community engagement, which includes review opportunity on that full draft. We'll be working through a bit of a steering committee meeting, and then we'll be working through into the early summer to actually finalize the document and bring it in front of council. And so a bit of exact confirmation on some of those dates later into June, but that is the intent, is that by early summer we have a final TMS document alongside a final OCP. Discussion. I feel like we've had good discussion, but I'm going to leave this up here in case there's any final thoughts, either TMS, OCP, or otherwise. I think I've appreciated what's come up. I think sessions like this with a very limited audience present a good opportunity to get down into details if we so choose. So if anything else on your minds, would love to hear it.
Maybe for Sean and Dan, for this one, in the Marchmont area, I honestly don't have a lot of experience with the area, with that side of the city, but I guess my perception is that they don't have a lot of people who live there, don't have a lot of places that they can walk to for, groceries and meals out and stuff like that. Is there is there thought to adding more commercial or mixed use areas for those neighborhoods? Like, it just seems like a lot of residential with not a lot of services, I guess. And maybe that's a false assumption.
Nope, I don't think it's a false assumption. It's definitely something that we looked at in there, and we did create the opportunity to create a neighborhood node just north of Marchmont in that area, kind of Chesterfield, I guess that neighborhood. But yeah, that would be like a walking distance, ideally, location for services and amenities potentially. Other than that, yeah, they're pretty much, there's a few things in there, but it is not too much happening in terms of commercial services.
Sean, was that something that came up much during our earlier community conversations in terms of like a desire for a, like a, whether it's commercial or social or otherwise, kind of like a hub, a central location for that on the east side of the highway?
Yeah, it's something that's come up, and we haven't spoken to too many residents from Marchmont specifically, at least those who have identified as being from that neighborhood. However, yeah, it was identified as a gap in stakeholder sessions and previous consultation. There was kind of the, the identification and need for kind of more services on that side. Brittany, you hit the nail on the head. It's like, very residential. It's kind of a little bit of a time capsule. Of Duncan before it became more of an urban center. So there's a definite opportunity, and the OCP supports that.
Yeah, I'm just picturing like all the main grocery stores are on the other side of the highway.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Not that we can, do much about that, but yeah, it just seems like not a lot within walking distance for those people.
Yeah, and it's a challenge of like transitions in neighborhoods like that, right? It's finding the parcel size that's adequate to support a substantial commercial development or redevelopment. That comes with time. The OCP is certainly supportive of it, but then again, we are dependent on the market to deliver that service in the end.
And that just brainstorming on that probably brings up the importance of making those connections both like safely and comfortably. If we're not going to get the mega grocery store on the east side of the highway, well, then how can we get people more comfortable walking in to access the services that are already in place?
Yeah. It is in a floodplain as well, so that creates challenges for redevelopment on top of that. So as Dan said, those connections are super important until the time comes that those properties redevelop.
That's an excellent point too. Yeah, and that's a really important one to note, that redevelopment of those lands is somewhat constrained, which is one of the reasons why there's not a significant intensification of Marchmont envisioned as well.
I mean, I would just add maybe to the same line of conversation that was what makes one of the defining features of your community is you have approximately 5,000 people in a very small geographic area. And so in terms of walkability, distance is often the, in many communities, it's sheer distance. People aren't going to walk a long distance to get to groceries or whatever it might be. We're fairly fortunate here in terms of like distance is not necessarily the limiting factor. It's some of the barriers that are in place that are preventing people from making those walking trips. And so it's really about kind of working to address those and making walking more appealing.
Excellent. Okay. So there's no further questions. It's been a great conversation, but yeah, we're available if through the play speak and the survey, there's lots of opportunity to continue to provide feedback as well. And if there's anyone who would like to follow up on this conversation, we'd be happy to respond to that.
Great, guys. Thanks so much for taking us through it. Such a little intimate group. And I look forward to going through all the stuff on Play Speak.
Excellent.
Appreciate the effort and making the time tonight too. It's very helpful. Very great.
Thank you so much for tonight. It was awesome. I really appreciate just the time you guys took to kind of go over everything. do a nice little summary so that when I can look into those things further, if there's any questions that come up, I can reach out and kind of get those questions answered.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you both. And thanks to Urban Systems for walking us all through this.
Great.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank
Okay.
you. Have a good night.
Everyone.
Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.
You have a good night.